Morning light slid across my kitchen tile like a slow tide, warming the terracotta and the small adobe walls I now call home. The kettle clicked off, and I poured English breakfast into my favorite chipped mug, the one with a faded library seal. My name is Eveline Marlowe, 72, retired librarian survivor of long winters and longer silences. Out here in Santa Fe, the air is kind to my lungs, and the sky looks like someone ironed it smooth. I had begun to believe I might live the rest of my days in that wide, easy blue. The phone rang. I let it buzz twice, then 3 times. Most mornings it's Ruth, my old neighbor from Virginia, calling to trade gossip and recipes. Today, the screen showed a name I hadn't seen in months. Daniel. My only child. My once-upon-a-time reason for everything. I answered. "Hello, Daniel." No greeting. Just his courtroom voice clipped and polished. "You need to be at my wedding. Brianna's family expects a perfect family front." I set the mug down, careful not to chip what was already cracked. Heat rose through my palm from the clay countertop. I could have said a dozen soft things, the motherly phrases that patch and postpone, but I have learned what delay costs. The truth came out steady. "Daniel, I've been living across the country for 9 months. You didn't even notice." Silence fell so sudden I could hear the house breathe the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant wind chime nudged by desert air. On the other end, a hitch, a tiny scramble, as if his shoes had slipped on polished marble. "What are you talking about?" he asked, and there it was. Not worry, not wonder, but indignation, as if I had stepped out of my assigned square. "I sold the house," I said. "I'm in New Mexico now." Another beat of quiet. Then the edge returned. "You'll regret this." I looked past the sink to the small courtyard where the sun was learning the pink face of my bougainvillea. "I don't think I will." He exhaled through his nose the way he did as a boy when told no. The call ended without goodbye. I set the phone face down and lifted my mug again. The tea had cooled, but I drank anyway, because warmth is a habit you keep even when it forgets to keep you. For a while, I stood at the window and watched a lizard claim a sliver of sunlight on the wall. I thought of how I'd packed that Virginia house in silence, how no one called the week I left, how easy it is to disappear from people who never really looked. I thought of Daniel's command of the words "perfect family," and how they fit like shoes that were never made for my feet. Invisible is not the same as gone. Today, I decided I would stay both seen and present, if only to myself. People like to imagine that walking away happens in one dramatic moment, a slammed door, a shouted goodbye. For me, it was years of slow erosion, like water carving a canyon, until one day, you finally see the emptiness staring back at you. When Daniel was little after his father passed, I did everything to hold our world together. I worked at the library during the day, cleaned offices at night, and stretched every dollar like taffy just to keep a roof over us. I went without new shoes, without vacations, without sleep. If he needed a field trip fee, I found it. If he wanted a baseball mitt, I picked up an extra shift. I thought sacrifice was the same thing as love. But as Daniel grew older, the comparison started. Every holiday dinner, he'd drop Brianna's mother into conversation as if she were a standard I'd failed to meet. "She's elegant, Mom," he'd say, or "she knows how to host a real dinner party." I'd smile politely, but inside, each word was another crack in the wall I'd built. Retirement should have been a time of peace. Instead, Daniel turned it into another ledger of what I was worth. He suggested so casually that maybe it was time to sell the house, the same one where I'd raised him, and consider a good assisted living community, as if I were a piece of old furniture, ready to be moved out of the way. That night, I sat in the kitchen under the weak glow of the overhead light, staring at the wallpaper Daniel had once drawn on with crayons. I realized I was nothing more than a backdrop in his story, and backdrops can be replaced. So I made my choice. I listed the Virginia house quietly, signed the papers without telling a soul, and packed box by box under the cover of night. When the moving truck pulled away, I followed in my old Buick headed west, not once looking back in the rearview mirror. Ruth, my neighbor of 40 years, hugged me at the curb before I left. Her words carried me more than the car ever could. You're not abandoning family, Eveline. You're finally choosing yourself. For the first time in my life, I believed her. The first morning I woke up in Santa Fe, I thought the sky had been painted just for me. My little stucco house sat on a quiet street, lined with juniper trees and red earth. It wasn't large, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with old cabinets, a courtyard just big enough for potted herbs, but it was mine, paid for in full, with the money from selling the Virginia house. No mortgage, no cosigner, no one reminding me who had helped me. The deed carried only my name, and that was a kind of freedom I'd never known. I filled the rooms, slowly choosing pieces that felt like companions rather than obligations. A second-hand oak table where I could drink my morning tea. A faded rug with desert colors that warmed the living room. A bookshelf where I arranged novels I'd carried across state lines. Each item was deliberate proof that I could build a life, one thoughtful choice at a time. Within weeks, I found myself joining a local book club at the library downtown. The women were a mix of ages, teachers, retirees, even a nurse who worked night shifts. They welcomed me with a kind of warmth I hadn't felt from family in years. On Saturdays, I volunteered at the History Museum, guiding tourists through exhibits of Pueblo pottery and Spanish colonial maps. Standing there, explaining stories to strangers, I felt my own story widen. Every Sunday, without fail, Ruth called from Virginia. Her voice carried across the miles like a rope tying us together. She never asked when I was coming back. She only wanted to hear what new trail I'd walked, what book I was reading, what flower had bloomed in my courtyard. Her laughter filled the silences that used to ache. For months, I lived in that silence like it was a long-awaited gift. No sudden demands, no guilt-tripped voicemails, no reminders of where I fell short. I could go whole days without thinking of Daniel or the sharp comparisons that had once defined me. The desert air felt cleaner because it wasn't thick with expectation. Then one morning, the phone rang. Daniel's name lit up the screen, sharp and insistent. His voice came through, not with curiosity, not with care, but with command. You need to be at my wedding. Brianna's family expects a perfect family front. The quiet I had built brick by brick cracked wide open, and in that instant, I knew peace was something he would never hand me. I would have to guard it myself. The next call came less than 2 days later. I had just set my teacup on the porch railing, watching the evening light spill across the mountains, when Daniel's name appeared again. I almost let it ring out, but habit still had its claws in me. Why aren't you answering my messages? His voice carried an edge more command than question. I've answered, I said evenly. I told you I'm not coming. You don't understand, he snapped. Brianna's family expects everyone present. If you're not there, people will talk. They'll think something's wrong. I almost laughed. For decades, nothing I did mattered. Now suddenly my absence threatened the facade. So now I'm valuable, I murmured as a prop. He didn't hear me, or maybe he chose not to. This wedding is important. You need to think of family loyalty. Family loyalty. The phrase landed like a stone in my chest. Where was that loyalty when I worked nights to keep food on the table? When my milestones vanished in Felicity-style shadows? Oh wait, no Felicity here, just Daniel. My milestones were eclipsed by his own expectations. By the time the call ended, my phone buzzed again, this time with texts. Brianna's name, unfamiliar, until now filled the screen. Eveline, this wedding is about unity. Daniel needs you there. Don't make us look bad in front of my parents." The words blurred together until they formed a single chant. Appearances. Appearances, appearances. I set the phone face down and stared at the fading sun. My pulse drummed in my ears, not from guilt, but from recognition. They didn't want me because I was Eveline, the woman who sacrificed, the mother who endured. They wanted me as a backdrop, an extra in their production of Perfect Family. Another message arrived. "You'll regret this. Everyone will." I breathed slowly, letting the desert air cool the heat rising in my chest. Part of me wanted to block them both, to seal my peace with one press of a button. But another part, the same part that once stayed up nights cataloging books no one borrowed, wanted to see just how far this campaign would go. That's when it struck me. Daniel had no idea where I lived. 9 months gone, and not once had he asked my address, my street, my corner of sky. To him, I existed only as a phone number, a pawn he could summon at will. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet night settling around me, and thought a pawn can leave the board. And I was already halfway out the door. It's strange what memory chooses to unearth when the present feels unsteady. That night, after Daniel and Brianna's messages finally went silent, I found myself staring at the ceiling fan as it whirred above me, and the past replayed in sharp detail. I remembered the years after my husband's death when Daniel was still in school, and every bill felt like a mountain. I worked double shifts library by day, cleaning offices by night until my hands were cracked and raw. Vacations were out of the question. Birthdays meant a cake from the discount bakery and a candle stuck in the middle. When tuition deadlines came, I sold the last of my mother's jewelry, a small pearl brooch I'd once hoped to pass down. All of it, so he wouldn't carry the weight I did. And yet, even then, Daniel's gaze was always tilted toward someone else. He spoke of Brianna's mother with a reverence I never earned. She knows everyone, he'd say. She can open doors. At dinners, he compared my simple casseroles with the elaborate spreads Brianna's family hosted. The message was clear love was not enough. Connection, wealth status, that was the currency he valued. The last straw came a few years before I left. Daniel had stopped by on a Sunday, leaning against the doorway of my kitchen, looking around as though assessing inventory. "Mom," he said casual, as flipping a light switch. "You should sign the house over to me. It'll make the paperwork easier later." I froze the dish towel still in my hands. He spoke as though I were already gone, as if my home, my one fortress, after decades of scrimping, was nothing more than a line item waiting to be transferred. He smiled faintly, like it was reasonable, like I should be grateful he was thinking ahead. That was the moment something inside me hardened. I had given him my energy, my time, my health. I had bent my whole life into the shape of sacrifice. And still, it wasn't enough. Remembering that night now, I felt the old sting, but also a surge of clarity. Daniel and Brianna might clamor, might wield guilt like a weapon, but I'd lived too many years as an accessory to someone else's story. I would not sign away my peace, not for appearances, not for convenience, and certainly not for a wedding. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and dry, the desert sky stretching wide and cloudless. While Daniel and Brianna rehearsed smiles for cameras, I laced up my hiking boots and met Ruth at the trailhead just outside town. She'd flown in 2 days earlier, suitcase in hand, and that familiar spark in her eyes. Ready to disappear in plain sight, she teased, adjusting her sun hat. "More than ready," I said, and we started up the trail. The earth crunched beneath our shoes each step, pulling me further away from the weight of obligation. We climbed until Santa Fe shimmered small behind us, and the mountains rose in front like guardians. With Ruth beside me, the silence was not empty, but full of possibility, full of the kind of companionship that didn't demand performance. As I breathed the thin, pine-scented air, I imagined the reception hall back east. I could almost hear the music, the clink of champagne glasses, the rehearsed toasts, and then, inevitably, the whispers. "Where's Eveline?" a cousin would murmur. "She should be here," another relative would frown. Daniel, I knew, would scramble. He always did. "She's sick," he'd claim at first. Later, maybe she had work. By dessert, she's traveling. But lies unravel faster than ribbon. I wasn't there, but the story reached me later. Through family gossip delivered with the glee only scandal can bring. A distant cousin, never one for discretion, let slip the truth over dinner. She doesn't live in Virginia anymore. Sold her house last year. Moved west. Brianna's parents, sharp-eyed and traditional, pieced it together like a puzzle they hadn't wanted to solve. The groom had paraded himself as dutiful as family-centered, while in reality he hadn't even known where his own mother lived. Their faces reportedly stiffened polite smiles, curdling into thin lines. Whispers spread faster than champagne refills. Why hadn't he known? Why hadn't he cared? Guests glanced at Daniel, then at Brianna, the golden sheen of the evening dimming by degrees. And by the time the cake was cut, the perfect picture had cracked. Voices rose, explanations faltered, and the undercurrent of judgment ran strong. The bride's family, so invested in appearances, saw through the performance. Back on the trail, I stopped to sip water, the sun warming my shoulders. Ruth pointed to the horizon where the sky touched the mountains. "Looks like freedom to me," she said. I smiled, steady and unshaken. Somewhere far from that reception hall, the truth had finally spoken louder than I ever needed to. And I hadn't lifted a finger. The morning after the wedding, my phone buzzed so violently on the nightstand, it rattled my teacup. First came Brianna. "You humiliated us. My parents are furious. Do you realize what you've done?" A minute later, Daniel's voicemail. His tone was tight, almost strangled. "You ruined my marriage start. Do you ever think about anyone but yourself?" I sat at the kitchen table, the desert sun, cutting a bright stripe across the floor, and read each message once. Then I typed a single reply. "I didn't humiliate you. You did that by ignoring me." With that, I blocked them both. The silence afterward felt like balm, though I knew better than to trust silence to last. Family always has a way of finding cracks. That afternoon, I called a lawyer in town, Mr. Harrington, a silver-haired man whose office smelled faintly of leather and ink. He specialized in elder law and privacy, and he listened without interrupting as I explained. "I don't want them reaching me," I said. "Not at home, not by digging through records. This is my life now." He nodded, scribbling notes. "We can file to suppress your address from public databases. It takes some work, but it's doable. And your estate best to update it in case of future disputes." I knew exactly what he meant. For years, my will had Daniel's name written neatly on the line. By default, out of habit, out of some thin thread of hope. But hope can strangle, and habit can blind. So we rewrote it. With a calm hand, I directed everything, my modest savings, the little house in Santa Fe, even the royalties from a small pension, away from Daniel. Instead, I set it up as a scholarship trust for first-generation college students, kids who'd need the kind of help no one ever thought to give me. As I signed the papers, a strange quiet filled me. Not regret, not triumph, but something sturdier. Justice, maybe. The kind that doesn't shout or slam doors, but simply closes them with a final, satisfying click. When I stepped out of the lawyer's office into the bright New Mexico afternoon, I felt lighter. Daniel could rage, Brianna could scorn, but the truth was already carved in ink: my life, my choices, and the legacy I wanted to leave behind. Life in Santa Fe settled into a rhythm that felt like it had always been waiting for me. I enrolled in a painting class at the community center, where we gathered in a sunlit room that smelled faintly of turpentine and coffee. My hands, so used to scrubbing floors or folding laundry, now smeared bold streaks of color across canvas. It wasn't about talent, it was about expression, and I felt a freedom in those brushstrokes that words never gave me. On weekends, I dug into the soil of the small garden behind my stucco house. The desert climate was stubborn, but I coaxed tomatoes and lavender into life, marveling at every bloom as though it were a personal victory. Some evenings, I joined neighbors for simple dinners, sitting under strings of patio lights, the air buzzing with crickets and laughter that expected nothing from me but presence. When Ruth came to visit, she leaned back in her chair, a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. She looked at me, at the house, at the half-finished canvas propped by the window. "You finally chose yourself," she said with a grin. "Took you 72 years, but you did." I laughed, a sound that felt unburdened. I suppose I did. For the first time in decades, I wasn't bracing for a phone call or rearranging my life to fit someone else's expectations. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't a placeholder. I was a woman living on her own terms. I thought age meant slowing down. I admitted, glancing at the streaks of crimson drying on the canvas. But for me, it meant finally speeding away from chains. The words hung in the warm evening air, and I felt their truth settle deep. Freedom hadn't come early, but it had come. And it was mine. The months slipped by like the desert winds, quiet, steady, reshaping everything without noise. One evening, I sat at my desk, pen in hand, a sheet of thick cream paper before me. For weeks, the words had lingered at the edge of my mind, waiting for their shape. Now, they came smooth and unhurried. "Daniel, I wasn't your burden. You were mine. And I finally laid you down." I wrote about the years I carried him on my back, through grief, through sacrifice, through the endless comparisons to others. I wrote not with anger, but with a clarity that felt like cool water. When the ink dried, I folded the letter and slid it into the drawer beside my updated will. It wasn't meant for his eyes. It was meant for mine, for the quiet proof that I had spoken my truth at last. Outside, the New Mexico sky deepened into gold and rose. I carried my tea to the porch, settling into the chair where I could watch the sun dip behind the mountains. The wind moved through the sagebrush, whispering like an old companion. On the table beside me sat a small folder, the one holding documents Mr. Harrington had drawn up. Inside, clear as day, was the justice I had chosen. My estate redirected not to Daniel, but to a scholarship fund for first-generation students, and a share to Ruth, the friend who had reminded me I was still worth choosing. I sipped my tea, the taste strong and grounding. For the first time, my home, my peace, my legacy, all of it belonged only to me and those I chose. The desert quiet was no longer emptiness, it was freedom. And in that stillness, I smiled.